Scholars of Swift, I'm Professor Gallagher, and in this lesson we're going to update our to-do list app so that it will take advantage of the ultra easy-to-use SwiftData techniques that were introduced at Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference in June 2023. Now, you'll often hear SwiftData described as offering persistence. That just means that we can have access to a database where we can create, read, update, and delete data. Full CRUD capabilities. Now, if you work with SwiftUI, you're going to want to use SwiftData and not Apple's older Core Data framework. And I never actually introduced Core Data to my students. I thought it was a cumbersome framework that was difficult to understand, but with SwiftData, everything is modeled in code. This avoids having to use cumbersome setup screens that folks had to use when using Core Data. You'll see we write far less code than we did with our earlier to-do list app. Even though that app didn't use Core Data, it just saved a file out to our app directory, and you'll also see the use of SwiftData is very Swift-like. We're going to do everything in code. Now, to follow this lesson, you do need to have at least Xcode 15. I'm recording this lesson the week SwiftData was introduced, so I need to download the beta. If Xcode 15 is available in the App Store, download it from there. But if you're watching this before probably September 23, my guess is that Xcode 15 is still in beta. Now, if you can get Xcode 15 from the App Store, you should be able to install it there fine, just like you do any other application, but I need the beta, so I'm going to select the download button here for the beta option. Now, you'll see a lot of different options here, but really what we want is Xcode 15 beta. You can click on View Details. We'll just be working with the iOS 17 beta that's selected, and you can click on Xcode 15 beta and selected platforms. Now, a bit of a warning, at least in the early version that I'm using, I found that I needed to save the 3 files that were downloaded to my Downloads folder. Oftentimes, I'll save things to the desktop and run them from there. At least for me, it seemed that Xcode was expecting the installation to happen from my Downloads folder. Now, at the time that I'm recording this video, the beta version is going to download 3 files. All you need to do is to open the one that's xcode 15 beta.xip. That should install everything for you. You shouldn't need to touch any of the other files. Now, once the beta is installed, I'm going to drag it into my dock. I'm going to put the unzipped beta in my application folder, and now we can delete these 3 installation files. Then let's open up Xcode and get going. Now, if you've never used Xcode before, you're going to need an Apple developer account, and you'll also want a GitHub account. But if you had an older version of Xcode installed on your machine, those accounts should be read into your beta version, no problem. If you're totally new to Xcode, you're probably starting in the wrong place. Setup and installation and configuration are at the start of the playlist that I use for my course. Now, I'm going to be working through code that we created in Chapter 5 of the university course that I teach in SwiftUI. If you have those files, that's great, but if not, you can download the project where I'm going to be starting from my GitHub repo. So in this lesson, I'm going to show you how we can take an old project and update it to SwiftData. To get my project, you can just click on Clone Git Repository, and in the search box up top, enter the URL where I've stored the project online. https:// it's very important that you include that, at least in the version that I'm using. Then the URL github.com/Gallagher. My name is spelled unusually. It has a U in it, so it's spelled like gal, laugh, / to-do list with a capital T, capital D, capital L, -SwiftUI with a capital S, capital U, and capital I. Then press return. You should be asked where you want to save your project. I'm going to save mine to the desktop, and now you should have my project loaded up in Xcode for you to modify and work with. Now, I'm first going to set the scheme for the iOS device that I want to simulate, so I'll pull down the center of the toolbar, and I'm going to select iPhone 14 Pro. That's the iPhone device that I'm using as I record this lesson. Now, one more thing to do. I created this app before iOS 17's beta was released, but we're going to be using iOS 17 features for this app, so we need to modify the app so that it knows to use iOS 17 features. We do that by selecting the development target. To do this, click the blue icon in the project navigator. That's the first icon. You should have to-do list selected under targets in the left. Make sure the General tab is pressed, and under minimum development, you can pull down this menu and select at least iOS 17. If you have a higher number in here, you can select that as well if you'd like. Now, to give you a sense of how things are going to change, in our prior app, we had a model, which was a struct expressing our data, and a view model, which linked our views, our user interface, to our model, and that view model handled all of our data manipulation. Now, we're going to see in the update to this app that SwiftData is so efficient with so much built in that we aren't going to create a view model file at all. We'll just use one single model, which will be a class, not a struct this time. That's what SwiftData wants, and you'll see that we can eliminate a lot of code that we previously wrote in our view model. Now, that doesn't mean that MVVM goes away, but the approach that I'm using here is very similar to examples that Apple used when they introduced SwiftData, data, and it really is architecturally sound, especially for a small app like ours. Now, after we go through this, what I'm about to do might look a little weird to you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the view model, and I'm going to update our model so that it can use SwiftData. Normally what I do is I just change the ToDo Swift file that you see here, the model, but for some reason, at least in the beta of Xcode that I'm using, Xcode wasn't re-indexing changed object names properly. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to copy over some properties from my model struct into the view model class. I'll delete the model file with this struct, and I'll rename what used to be our view model to a model that we're going to use with SwiftData. So in the ToDo Swift file, the model file, I'm going to highlight the properties inside this struct, copy them, then head to our ToDo view model, and before I paste them in, I'm going to highlight and delete everything in between the class's curlies. We don't need any of this code. No more view model in our to-do list app. Then I'm going to paste in the properties from the struct. Again, SwiftData wants the model to be a class. I'll cover more of why in future lessons. And now with these properties pasted in here, we're not going to use an ID and conform to observable either. So I'm going to delete the ID property. Instead, in just a bit, I'm going to show you that we can enforce our item name to be unique, something that we can do with SwiftData. Now, before we get there, we need to import SwiftData. And since we don't need the to-do struct anymore, I'm going to right-click on it and select delete and select the top option to move the file to the trash. And then back in our to-do view model, I'm going to change the name to to-do. So I'm going to right-click on to-do view model, refactor, rename, and rename this as to-do. This is our new model. And we no longer need observable object. One of the most confusing parts of SwiftUI was figuring out when to use observable object, state object, environment object. This has been greatly simplified with SwiftUI updates and even more so in SwiftData. So we can just delete this observable object conformance, make sure you get the colon out of there too, and all we need to do is add @model above the class declaration. Make sure that's capital M. Now this @model actually uses a new technique in Swift 5.9 called Swift macros. What this is going to do is it's going to write a lot of supporting code behind the scenes that the developer won't need to worry about. Less code, taken care of by Apple. That sounds good to me. So @model is a Swift macro for SwiftData. So @model is going to make sure that our data model uses SwiftData for persistence for file saving. We don't need to work with the document directory anymore. No more coding and decoding JSON files. And in our simple app, we're just scratching the surface with a single model, but we can use lots of different models and have them relate together in the way that you would relate files in a relational database. I'll show you how to do that in a future app. But for now, we'll just use this one model to represent how a given to-do item will be expressed. Now, I did think that since every element in my class had a default value that I wouldn't need to create a designated initializer, but it seems, at least with the current beta that I'm using, I need to add an init function, but it's super easy to do in Xcode. I just type init. Code completion will offer to fill in the rest, so I'll press return, and boom, done. Well, almost done, at least in the current version of the Xcode beta that I'm using. Code completion didn't pick up the fact that my due date is the Apple default date type with a capital D, so I'll enter capital D date in here. Again, make sure that's date with an E at the end, not data with an A at the end. It's an easy mistake to make in code completion. And I don't need date before my .now. It's no problem if you leave it in there, it's just redundant. Now, if you're curious what this model macro stuff is all about, you can actually right-click on the word model and select expand macro. And by the hair of Craig Federighi, will you look at that? The macro wrote a ton of code for us. But what's wonderful is we can ignore all of this. We don't need to know what it does. Since Apple wrote this macro, we can just trust in the SwiftUI team. And since some of my former students are Apple engineers, I do trust them. And we can right-click on model and select hide macro and know this is just going to do its work. Cool. Now, one more thing I want to do with my model, since I got rid of the ID property and I'm no longer conforming to identifiable, I want to make sure that my items property in here is going to be uniquely named. This way, SwiftUI will allow me to use this in statements like for each without having to have an ID property. And I can do this with SwiftData by adding the @attribute property wrapper in front of the var item definition. Now, when I open parentheses here and type dot, I can specify lots of different property attributes. I want to say .unique here to indicate that no two items are named the same. Now, do know that if you did try to save two items with the same name, your app would currently generate an error. I'm going to cover handling how we get through those errors after the beta period is done, and we can be sure that Apple's locked down the code and they have a recommended way for us to deal with potential conflicts. So again, as our first step, we got rid of a lot of code. We imported SwiftData. In this example, we don't even need a view model, although there will be cases where you want to have a view model in more complex apps. We converted our struct to a class. We added a model macro. We added a class initializer, no more observable object or codable. But in this example, we also got rid of the ID property and identifiable and used attribute unique instead. Now, previously, we also had to update the first file in our app, the app file. For us, that's the to-do list app file. And we still need to make a minor change in here, but we'll get rid of some of the complexity that was in here as well. We no longer need to worry about creating a state object, so we can delete this line here. Now, let's also import SwiftData. And now down here, we're no longer passing in an environment object into the view hierarchy, so we'll completely delete this line here. But we do need to set up something called a model container. Now, the model container essentially manages the app schema. That's the models you've created and how those relates to files that are stored behind the scenes, and the model container manages storage in your app. If it helps, you can think of the model container as holding the models that we're using in our app. We do this by adding a .model container modifier below the first view in our app. That's our to-do list view. Select the model container option with the for parameter. And for the parameter that we're going to pass in, it's just going to be the name of the class that we're using as a model for our app. That's to-do with .self at the end. Now, it is possible to have multiple models in your app. Say, if you had an app that was keeping track of courses, teachers, students, and registration data, we could pass in multiple models in the model container just by putting them inside of an array. We'll do something like this in a future app. So again, the changes in the app file are that we import SwiftData, we remove the state object, and we replace the environment object modifier with a model container for modifier, passing in any models that we'll be using in the app. Now let's make some changes to our to-do list view. Remember, this is the first view that's loaded as part of our app. Now, we'll first import SwiftData, and we also need to tell the view that it's going to be using the model context that we set up in the previous file. So we do this by adding an @environment variable down here, and in between parens, we're going to pass in \model context, lower camel case, var model context. Now, this just creates a variable that we can refer to that will let us access the data in our model container. Now, I'd actually prefer that this was also called model container, but remember, model container is where we set this up in the app file like we did right here, and we refer to this using the model context environment variable. We could call this anything, but for simplicity, I'm calling this model context. Now, in the old app, we were using an @environment object that was our view model, but we're not going to use this anymore. Instead, I'm going to replace this with a variable that we create using the @query property wrapper. Now, we use @query whenever we want to display data from SwiftData in our user interface. So what @query does is it actually gets data from our SwiftData container. So the value that we set up in @query will also trigger view updates on every change to the model, similar to how @state would do that. So we'll follow @query with var, and I'll name this variable to-dos, plural, lower camel case with a colon after it, in between square brackets, upper camel case to-do, because this is an array of to-do model elements. Now we'll see we get errors whenever we refer to the old to-dos VM view model value. So in our for each, we're going to iterate through our new to-dos value that contains data that we got from our query. Now we'll still call each element to-do, but before, when we tapped on a row in our list to toggle the checkbox, we called a method toggle completed that was in our view model. Now we no longer need this. Remember, SwiftData is so efficient that we got rid of our view model here. So if we simply say to-do.isCompleted.toggle open and close parens, this will change the isCompleted property, which is a property of the to-do model, of this to-do element from false to true or true to false. And this line up here will show a check mark if the to-do is completed or an empty rectangle if it's not, and SwiftData will automatically save these changes for us. We don't need to call any sort of save method. It happens automatically. Auto-saving data, how about that? It almost seems too easy, but it works. Now earlier we used the onDelete and onMove methods that we can call from for each to call methods that we wrote in our view model, but we got rid of the view model, and we don't want these methods here anymore, so let's delete them. And in fact, we can also delete the comments that we had in here. These were just used to illustrate the SwiftUI shorthand for these methods. And we're also going to get rid of the edit button that's in the upper left hand of our navigation bar. We're going to do that because we're no longer going to move items around. In the next video, I'll show you how we can sort and filter data that's returned by query, and to handle deletions, we'll just implement that with a swipe left. So just delete this toolbar item with the edit button in it. Now, one of the things I'd mentioned to my students is that I really never liked how SwiftUI handled the preview provider, and I'd hoped that a SwiftUI update would change that, and in fact my wish has come true. And we'll see the preview code has become much simplified. I'm going to highlight and delete the old preview provider code, and I'll replace that with hashtag capital P preview, open and close curlies, and we'll call to-do list view with open and close parens. That should be all we need to do to get live preview working. I'll refresh my preview, but I've still got some errors in here to fix. But they're not in this file, they're in the detail view file, so let's head over there. Now in detail view, I'm also going to import SwiftData. We no longer need our environment object. That referred to the view model that we deleted, so I'm going to delete this line here, but we also need to set up our model context. That enables this view to work with the data that's saved in SwiftData, and we do that with @environment, open and close parens, passing in \model context, lower camel case, and we'll say var since we're creating a variable, and we'll also call this model context. We don't specify a type or initialize this, that's all taken care of when we use this environment property wrapper. And this is the exact same line that we used in our prior view, it just lets us refer to the data that's in our model container. Now back in detail view, we're going to keep our state variable here. Remember, this either holds a new to-do if we click on the plus button, or it'll accept a to-do that we pass over if we click on a row in our list. But how do we save the to-do? Well, down here in our save button action, we're no longer going to call the save to do method that we wrote in our view model. We got rid of that. So let's delete this line, and instead what we need to do is refer to our model context. This is the model context variable that we just created above, and this says that we're working with data from our model or models that are inside of our model container. Then we say dot to access the methods we can use for that model context, and there are a bunch of them in here, including delete, which we'll see in just a bit, but right now we just want to call insert. This option here where we're inserting data into our model, and by entering our to-do variable, lower camel case, SwiftData knows that this is of type to-do, so it will insert this data into our model container. Or it might help to think of this as inserting data into the file that holds our to-do data. That's it. No additional method needed. Again, super easy, almost like magic. Now we're also going to get rid of the old preview provider code that we have in here, delete that. We'll replace that with, again, hashtag preview, open and close curlies. We're going to pass in detail view. Remember, this time it wants a to-do value in here, so we'll just say capital to-do, open and close parens inside. Now, in order to be able to show what's in the navigation bar, we also need to embed this in a navigation stack. So I'll right-click on Detail View, select Embed, and change Container to Navigation Stack. And this still isn't going to work. We'll get errors. We need to do one more thing in here. We need to add a .model container modifier in here. And for the for property we're going to pass in, we'll say upper camel case to-do.self. That refers to the class, the type of data that we're going to be using in here. And we see that our live preview is showing up, no errors. Let's head back to our to-do list view, and here's where we're going to add some code to swipe to delete. Now it's going to be inside the for each, so right under the H stack here, I'm going to add this right after the font title 2 modifier, and I'm going to add a modifier that says .swipe actions followed by open and close curlies. Now this will let us add actions between the curlies to perform when we swipe left, and inside the curlies I'm going to add a button. This time let's choose the button with the options that are title key, role, and action, and press return. Now the title key will be the string delete, that's the button's title. The role will be .destructive. This is going to turn the button's background to red, which is standard for delete buttons, and then I'll tab over to action and press return for the trailing closure format, and this is where we refer to our model context variable again. So we'll say model context dot, and this time we're going to select the delete method, and the object that we're going to pass in will be the to-do variable that we have inside this for each statement here, and that's it. With model context, we don't need any special view model function to delete data from SwiftData. Again, it's magical. Now, unfortunately, if I try to run a live preview, my beta version of Xcode crashes, maybe yours doesn't, but the simulator works, so I'll press build and run play button up top. Hammer time, no errors, our app is running. Let's click plus and add data. Now my buggy beta version of Xcode has some messages showing in the debug pane. You can ignore those. Remember, you can click the icons in the lower right to make sure that your console is showing. And another buggy thing that I've noticed is that the keyboard in the simulator doesn't work well. But you can just go to the I/O menu, select keyboards, then check Control Hardware Keyboard off and then on again, and that should allow you to type in your Mac's keyboard and have it show up in the simulator. So this to-do item will be update to-do lists for SwiftData, and I'll turn on a reminder, and my note is awesome, and click save, and sweet Johnny Ive, will you look at that? Our first to-do shows up in our list. And I'll add another exercise. I'll add it right now. I'll say do it now and save, and boom, now it's in the list. How about another? Send out stickers. The note is hashtag built with Prof G. By the way, I select somebody that posts a video or image from your work on lessons from our YouTube channel and send a sticker free in the world anywhere each week. So be sure to post a vid or image of your work if you want to get one of these My Mac Builds app stickers. They're cool. And I need another to do. I'll remind myself to make my daughter's birthday gift. She wants a disco button. By the way, I showed how you can build this in the maker content that you'll find on my site. I should be sure to do this by Saturday. Then I'll click Save. And what happens if we click an item like exercise here? I can update the title, save, and list updates. And if I click the rectangle, it's toggled as complete. And to show that data has persisted, I'm going to quit the simulator, Command Q. It's closed, my app is no longer running, but I'll press the play button in Xcode again, and ding dang data darlings, will you look at that? Swift loaded up all of our data using the query property wrapper. Looking good. Let's try some changes. Make sure those are going to be saved. I'll swipe left and delete exercise. Works great. I'll click on send out stickers. The simulator continues to be buggy, so I need to toggle the hardware keyboard off and on again. And I'll say to Austria, since this week I sent out stickers to a student in Austria. Again, I'll save those anywhere in the world for free if you post a pic or vid to your build using our hashtag. Quit the simulator with Command Q, restart with the play button, and through the magic of SwiftData, our app loads and we can see all of our changes have persisted. Outstanding work, Swifter! So we've learned a lot in this lesson. SwiftData, the model macro. We learned to use far less code to save data using SwiftData. We used the query property wrapper to fetch data. We learned about the model container and model context, and we used the insert and delete methods, and we learned how to work with simplified preview code. In the next lesson, I'll show you how you can modify our query property so that it can sort, order, and filter returned results. If you haven't liked and subscribed to the channel, please do so. Tell your buddies that there's a free high-quality college course available online at this URL, and continue to hack.